At 9,000 feet over the Assam Valley, Second Lieutenant Philip Adair leveled his P-40 out of a climb and looked east. What he saw made his stomach drop. 59 Japanese aircraft, 24 bombers locked in tight formation, 35 fighters weaving above and below them, all pointed straight at Dinjan airfield. He was alone. His flight had scattered somewhere behind him in the climb, and there was no time to find them. Below, on that airstrip, sat the transport planes that kept China's war alive, the fuel, the wounded, the entire lifeline of the hump airlift. Standard doctrine was simple. When you are outnumbered 5-1, you wait. You call for help. You shadow the enemy until reinforcements arrive. Adair was outnumbered nearly 60-1. There was no doctrine for that. He had two choices: watch the bombers reach their target, or push the throttle forward and find out what one Warhawk could do against an entire raid. He chose to fight. What happened over the next few minutes would earn him the Silver Star, and it started the moment he decided that the odds did not matter, only the airfield below him did. The morning of December 13, 1943, began the way most mornings began, at Nagaghuli Airfield, in the Assam Valley of northeast India. Mist clung low over the tea plantations that bordered the runway. The air smelled of aviation fuel and wet grass. Ground crews moved between rows of Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, checking oil lines, loading belts of .50 caliber ammunition, running fingers along wings still cold from the night. On the nose of nearly every aircraft in the squadron sat the same insignia, a wide white skull painted across the engine cowling, teeth bared, eye sockets hollow and staring. The pilots of the 89th Fighter Squadron had earned that nickname through blood and repetition. Everyone in the China-Burma-India theater called them the Burma Banshees. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair walked the flight line that morning like he had walked it dozens of times before. His aircraft, a P-40 marked with the number 44 on its fuselage, carried a name painted just below the cockpit rail: Lulu Bell. It was a small comfort in a theater that offered few comforts. The squadron's living quarters sat a short walk from the flight line, a row of bamboo and canvas bashas that did little against the monsoon rains still lingering in memory from months earlier. Pilots here lived with a particular kind of fatigue, not the exhaustion of constant combat, but the slower grind of heat, insects, and a climate that rotted boot leather in weeks. Malaria took more men out of the squadron than Japanese guns did. Mail from home arrived in irregular batches, sometimes 3 letters at once, sometimes nothing for a month. Adair, like most of the pilots around him, had learned to measure time not in weeks but in missions flown, in engine hours logged, in the slow accumulation of small routines that made an unfamiliar country feel survivable. He was young, still young enough that flight instructors back in the United States had been closer to him in age than experience. But the theater aged a man quickly. 6 months in the China-Burma-India Command taught lessons no training command ever could. Lessons about patience, about waiting for weather to clear, about trusting an aircraft that Europe and the Pacific had already begun retiring from frontline service. The China-Burma-India theater sat at the bottom of every supply list the United States Army Air Force maintained. Pilots here flew aircraft considered obsolete by the standards of Europe and the Pacific. The P-40 could not climb as high as a Spitfire. It could not turn as tightly as the fighters it faced. What it could do was absorb punishment and keep flying, and in this theater, that mattered more than anything else. The P-40 Warhawk beneath him carried an Allison V1710 liquid-cooled engine, rated at over 1,200 horsepower, driving the aircraft to a top speed just short of 380 miles an hour in level flight below 12,000 feet. 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns sat in the wings, 3 to a side, capable of a devastating rate of fire but limited by the ammunition each gun could carry, perhaps a dozen seconds of sustained firing before the belts ran empty. Against the Oscar, the P-40 was faster in a straight line and heavier in its punch, but it could not match the Japanese fighter in a turning fight. The Oscar's lighter airframe and combat flaps let it bleed speed and snapped through turns no American fighter in the theater could follow. Every pilot who flew against the Oscar learned the same lesson early or did not survive long enough to learn it at all. Never turn with an Oscar. Use speed, extend, reset. It was a rule built from the wreckage of pilots who had tried the opposite. To understand why Adair and his squadron existed at all, you had to understand the hump. Since the fall of Burma to Japanese forces in 1942, the only way to supply Chiang Kai-shek's forces fighting in China was by air, over the eastern edge of the Himalayas. Cargo planes loaded with fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies flew a route so dangerous that crews called the mountains beneath them the Aluminum Trail, for all the wreckage scattered across the peaks. The airfields that supported this route, places like Dinjan, were not just military installations. They were the only lifeline keeping an entire ally in the war. If the Japanese could destroy those airfields, they could starve the China theater of everything it needed to keep fighting. The 80th Fighter Group existed for one purpose: keep those airfields standing. Adair had flown enough missions by December to understand the rhythm of the war here. Reconnaissance flights, escort missions for the transport planes, the occasional scramble when radar or a forward observer reported Japanese aircraft crossing into Allied airspace. Most of those scrambles ended without contact. The formation would climb, patrol a sector, and return to base having seen nothing but cloud and jungle canopy stretching to the horizon. There was no reason to expect this particular morning to be any different. The alert came in shortly after dawn. A spotter reported Japanese aircraft massing over occupied territory to the east, moving in the general direction of the hump airfields. The squadron scrambled. Pilots ran for their aircraft, engines coughed to life, and one by one the P-40s lifted off the dirt strip and began climbing toward assembly altitude, where the flight would form up before heading toward the reported contact. Climbing a P-40 to altitude took time, and during that climb formations could scatter. Engines ran at different rates of climb. Pilots lost sight of their leaders in haze or cloud. It happened more often than anyone liked to admit, and on this particular morning, it happened to Adair. Somewhere between the runway and assembly altitude, he lost his flight. He throttled back, scanned the sky, banked to try to catch sight of familiar aircraft silhouettes against the brightening horizon. Nothing. The radio carried only static and distant chatter he could not place. He was, for the moment, alone in the sky over Assam. Being separated from your flight was not supposed to be dangerous. Standard procedure called for a lone pilot to orbit, try to re-establish contact, and if that failed, return to base, rather than risk engaging enemy aircraft without support. A single fighter caught alone against an organized enemy formation was, by every rule taught in flight training, at a severe disadvantage. Doctrine held that a fighter pilot should avoid combat when outnumbered by more than 5-1. 5-1 was already considered reckless odds. Adair leveled out at altitude and continued scanning the horizon east, toward the direction the alert had indicated. For a long moment there was nothing but empty sky and the drone of his own engine. Then he saw it. At first it looked like a smudge of dark specks against the pale morning haze, the kind of visual artifact a tired pilot might dismiss as birds or a trick of the light. But the specks did not scatter the way birds scattered. They held formation. As he watched, the smudge resolved into shapes, dozens of them, arranged in disciplined layers across the sky. Bombers in the center, tight defensive boxes of 6 aircraft each. Fighters above and below, weaving in loose cover formations, watching for exactly the kind of interception the Japanese air planners expected somewhere near the target. Adair began counting, the way every fighter pilot in the theater had trained himself to count when he spotted enemy aircraft. Bomber formation, 24 aircraft, Mitsubishi Ki-21s, the type Allied intelligence had nicknamed Sally. Above and below them, dozens more, smaller, faster silhouettes he recognized immediately as Nakajima Ki-43s. The Oscar, an aircraft that had earned a fearsome reputation across Burma and northeast India for its ability to outturn nearly anything the Allies could put into the air. 35 of them, arranged to protect the bombers from exactly the kind of single interceptor now watching them from 4,000 feet above. 59 aircraft in total. Some pilots who later told this story rounded the number up to 64, folding in stragglers and outliers at the edge of the formation. However you counted it, one fact did not change. There was one American fighter in the sky, and there were more Japanese aircraft below him than most fighter pilots would see in an entire combat tour. And they were heading directly for Dinjan. Adair understood immediately what that meant. Dinjan was not just another airstrip. It was one of the primary loading fields for the hump route, a place where American transport aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip loading fuel and cargo bound for China. If 24 bombers reached that field unopposed, the damage would not be measured only in aircraft destroyed on the ground. It would be measured in weeks of interrupted supply to an entire theater of war, in soldiers in China who would not receive the ammunition and medicine already loaded and waiting. He checked his fuel. Full internal tanks. He checked his position. He was already above and to the flank of the formation, in a position no Japanese pilot expected an interceptor to be, not this far from the target. Standard Doctrine told him to orbit, to call for help, to wait for the rest of his squadron to find the formation and engage together, the way every training manual said an outnumbered fighter should behave. But Doctrine had been written for pilots facing 5-to-1 odds, not 59-to-1. There was no procedure for this. Calling for help meant accepting that by the time reinforcements arrived, the bombers would already be over Dinjan, their bomb bay doors already open. Orbiting and waiting meant watching the airfield below him take a beating he might have been able to prevent. Adair made his decision in the time it took to glance once more at the formation, grinding steadily toward the airfield. He was not going to wait. He pushed the throttle forward, felt the Allison engine respond beneath him, and rolled his wings toward the largest concentration of enemy aircraft the China-Burma-India theater had thrown at a single American pilot that year. Whatever happened next, he was going in alone. Adair rolled his wings level and pushed the nose down, trading altitude for speed the way every instructor who had ever trained him would have approved of, at least in principle, if not for the numbers involved. 4,000 feet below, the Japanese formation continued its steady drone toward Dinjan, unaware that a single American fighter had positioned itself exactly where Japanese doctrine assumed no interceptor would be. Standard tactics called for defenders to meet an incoming raid near the target, where radar and ground observers could vector fighters into position with precision. Nobody expected a lone P-40 to be waiting 20 miles out, above and to the flank, with the morning sun at his back. That single fact, more than any advantage in speed or firepower, was the only thing Adair had in his favor: surprise. He intended to spend it before it evaporated. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 miles an hour as he dove. Wind noise built into a steady roar around the canopy. Below him, the escort fighters continued their loose weave above and below the bomber stream, eyes forward, watching the empty sky ahead of the formation rather than the empty sky behind and above it. Adair picked his first target, a Ki-43 flying at the outer edge of the upper escort screen, and adjusted his dive to bring his gun sight onto it. He closed the distance in seconds. At close range he opened fire, all 650 caliber Brownings, hammering in a short burst that walked tracers directly into the Oscar's fuselage. The lightweight Japanese fighter had almost no armor protecting its pilot, and no self-sealing fuel tanks, a design choice that had bought it extraordinary agility at the cost of survivability. The rounds tore through it. The Oscar rolled off on one wing and began falling away, trailing smoke, out of the fight before its pilot had likely even registered where the attack had come from. Adair did not slow down to watch it fall. He held his dive, aiming now for the bomber formation itself, and as he passed through the level of the Ki-21s, he fired again, a shorter burst this time, rounds striking the fuselage and wing root of one of the lead Sally bombers. The bomber shuddered under the impact. Smoke began trailing from one engine. It did not fall out of the sky, not yet, but it fell out of formation, easing away from the tight defensive box the other bombers had been holding since they crossed the border. That mattered more than it might have seemed in the moment. A tight bomber formation existed for a reason. Massed defensive fire from a dozen gunners was far more dangerous to an attacking fighter than the fire from a single isolated aircraft, and massed formations dropped their bombs with far greater accuracy than scattered ones. The moment a bomber broke formation, whether from damage or simple caution, the entire group's effectiveness against the target below began to erode. Adair had spent less than 10 seconds in his first pass, and he had already cost the Japanese raid a fighter and a measure of the cohesion it needed to hit Dinjan hard. He did not have time to feel any satisfaction about it. There was no room in a fight like this for anything but the next half second. His hands moved over stick and throttle almost without conscious thought, the product of hundreds of hours logged over the jungle and the tea plantations below. Hours that had taught his body to fly the aircraft, while his mind stayed free to track the shifting geometry of a battle unfolding in 3 dimensions all around him. Below and behind him, the rest of the escort screen had finally seen him. 6 Ki-43s peeled away from their positions and turned to intercept, engines opening up, the distinctive high-pitched whine of their Nakajima radials rising as they climbed to meet the single P-40 that had just torn through their formation. Adair pulled out of his dive and immediately remembered the rule every pilot in the theater had learned from watching better men die learning it the hard way: never turn with an Oscar. The Ki-43 could bank harder, hold a tighter radius, and bleed speed through a turn without stalling in a way no American fighter in the theater could match. Its combat flaps, a feature the Allies had only begun to understand through captured aircraft and hard combat experience, let Japanese pilots snap into turns that looked, from the outside, almost impossible for an aircraft of that size and weight. A P-40 pilot who tried to match that turn would find himself losing airspeed and altitude at a rate the lighter Japanese fighter simply did not suffer, and within a few seconds he would find an Oscar sitting comfortably on his tail with nothing he could do about it. So Adair did not turn with them. He used the one advantage his aircraft held over theirs: speed. He rolled away from the first pair of incoming Oscars, put his nose down, and let the P-40 accelerate in a shallow dive, opening the range before the Japanese fighters could close on him. It was not a maneuver that felt like winning. It felt like running. But running, in this particular fight, was the only tactic that kept him alive long enough to make his next attack count. The negative sensation of that first hard dive stayed with him, the momentary lightness in his stomach as the nose dropped, the pressure building back into his seat as he leveled out, the cold sweat already gathering under his flight suit, despite the thin, cool air at altitude. Below him, the jungle stretched away in every direction, a dense green canopy broken only by the silver thread of a river, and far to the west, the faint suggestion of the airstrip he had taken off from less than half an hour earlier. There was no help coming from the ground, no radio vector, no friendly voice reading off enemy positions. Whatever happened next would be decided entirely by what he could see, judge, and react to inside the cramped confines of his own cockpit. He leveled out below the bomber stream, checked his tail, and saw the Oscars still descending after him, unable to match his diving speed, but closing the gap regardless with the patient persistence of pilots who knew exactly how this kind of fight usually ended. Adair had perhaps a few seconds before they caught up to firing range. He used them to line up on the bomber formation again. The Sally bombers had begun to react to the loss of their wingman and the disruption of their tight formation. Some were tightening back into position, trying to re-establish the defensive box. Others had eased wider, wary of another attack from an angle they had not anticipated. Adair picked the nearest aircraft, still holding close formation, and fired another burst as he passed beneath and behind it. Rounds struck the fuselage. He could not tell in the half-second of the pass whether the hits had done serious damage or merely dented aluminum skin, and there was no time to find out, because the pursuing Oscars had closed to firing range behind him. Tracers streaked past his canopy, close enough that he felt, more than saw, how near they had come. He broke hard right, using the P-40's superior diving speed and structural strength to pull out of a maneuver, and Oscar's lighter airframe would have struggled to survive at the same speed. The Japanese fighters overshot, unable to match his turn radius at that velocity, and for a moment, Adair had breathing room again. It did not last. More Oscars had climbed to join the fight, drawn by the sight of their formation under attack from a single aircraft that refused to behave the way an isolated fighter facing 60-to-1 odds was supposed to behave. Where standard doctrine assumed a lone pilot would retreat or attempt only a single hit-and-run pass before disengaging entirely, Adair kept reversing back into the fight, refusing to give the bombers below him a clear, uncontested run at Dinjan. The dogfight that followed did not resemble the clean, single-pass attacks of the opening seconds. It became something messier, a running series of reversals, near misses, and snapshots taken in the half-second window before an enemy fighter could bring its own guns to bear. Adair rolled into a diving turn to avoid one Oscar closing from his high six, felt his aircraft shudder as rounds from a second fighter he had not seen struck somewhere behind the cockpit, and pulled hard into a climbing reversal that put his own gun sight, for just a moment, onto the belly of an Oscar that had overshot trying to follow him. He fired. The burst was short, his ammunition counter already falling toward half of what he had carried into the fight, but it found the target. Rounds stitched across the Oscar's wing root and engine cowling. The Japanese fighter did not go down in flames the way the first one had, but it broke off immediately, trailing a thin stream of white vapor from a punctured coolant line, diving away from the fight rather than risk pressing an attack in a damaged aircraft. Adair had no way of confirming, in that moment, whether it would make it back to its own field. Later, the official record would credit it as damaged rather than destroyed, one of two additional Oscars he would be credited with damaging before the fight was over. The remaining fighters did not relent. If anything, the loss of two of their own and the damage to a third seemed to sharpen their determination to bring down the single American aircraft that had turned what should have been an unopposed bombing run into a running battle. Adair felt his P-40 absorb hit after hit as the fight wore on, the dull thud of rounds striking aluminum skin transmitted through the airframe into the stick and rudder pedals, a language of impacts he had learned, out of necessity, to interpret without looking. A hit in the wing meant lost lift, a slight heaviness in the controls. A hit near the tail meant a shudder through the rudder pedals that told him his margin for aggressive maneuvering had just narrowed further. He kept fighting anyway. There was a particular kind of fatigue that set in during a fight like this, one that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion and everything to do with the sheer density of decisions crowded into every few seconds. Which way to brake? Whether the aircraft closing from the left was close enough to matter yet. Whether the shudder just felt through the airframe meant a jammed gun, a punctured fuel line, or nothing worse than a near miss rattling the wings. Adair had no time to sort through those questions individually. He processed them the way a man wading through fast water processes each foothold, by feel, by instinct built from repetition, trusting that his hands would find the right answer faster than his conscious mind ever could. The Ki-21 bombers below, for all their vulnerability, still carried defensive gunners in nose, dorsal, and tail positions, and a pilot pressing an attack against a bomber stream risked more than just the escort fighters circling above. Every pass Adair made through the bomber formation carried its own quiet risk, tracer fire from waist and tail gunners crossing his path in thin glowing lines, fire he had no way to return while his guns were occupied elsewhere. He had come to accept, somewhere in the opening minutes of the fight, that there was no version of this engagement that ended without his aircraft taking damage. The only question that mattered was how much, and whether the airframe underneath him would keep flying regardless. Below him, and increasingly to his advantage, the bomber formation had lost whatever cohesion it started the morning with. What had begun as tight defensive boxes of 6 aircraft each had spread into a loose, uneven column of individual bombers, some easing wider to avoid the fighting overhead, others slowing to let damaged wingmen catch up. A bomber formation that arrived over its target scattered like that would not achieve anything close to the concentrated bombing pattern needed to destroy an airfield's fuel stocks or parked transport aircraft. Every minute Adair kept the escort fighters occupied above him was a minute the bombers spent drifting further from the tight formation their bombardiers needed for an effective strike. He had no way to know, in the middle of the fight, whether this was working the way he hoped. There was no time to watch the bombers and fight the fighters simultaneously. He could only keep reversing, keep forcing the Oscars to overshoot or break off, keep his nose pointed at whatever target presented itself in the brief windows between defensive maneuvers, and trust that the chaos he was creating above the bomber stream was buying the ground crews and transport pilots at Dinjan the only thing that mattered: time. His ammunition counter continued falling. 6 guns, each with a magazine good for a matter of seconds of sustained fire, had been burning through their belts in short bursts for several minutes now, an eternity in a dogfight where most engagements were decided in the first 30 seconds. He fired another burst at an Oscar that had made the mistake of following him too closely through a diving turn, saw rounds strike its engine cowling, and watched it peel away trailing smoke. A second damaged fighter added to the tally, though he had no time to confirm it and no certainty it would not recover and rejoin the fight. More hits found his own aircraft. A string of rounds walked across his right wing, tearing through the thin aluminum skin near the wingtip. Another burst struck somewhere behind the cockpit, close enough that he felt the impact through the seat frame. His P-40, a rugged aircraft built to survive exactly this kind of punishment, kept flying, engine steady, controls sluggish in places but still responsive enough to keep him in the fight. It was not a comfortable position. It was, given the numbers arrayed against him, close to a miracle that he remained in the fight at all. Somewhere in the confusion of reversals and short bursts, Adair became aware that he was no longer entirely alone in the sky. Other aircraft, painted with the same skull insignia across their cowlings, had begun climbing into the engagement from the direction of Nagaghuli. His flight, or what remained of it after the scattered climb that had separated him from the group in the first place, had finally located the fight and were diving in to join it. Their arrival did not end the battle immediately. 60 aircraft, even scattered and disorganized, did not simply disperse the moment a handful of reinforcements arrived. But it changed the arithmetic in a way that mattered. With more American fighters now pressing the attack from multiple directions, the Japanese formation, already fraying under the disruption Adair had caused single-handedly in the opening minutes, began to come apart in earnest. Escort fighters that had been concentrating on the lone P-40 now had other targets to worry about. Bombers that had been struggling to hold formation against one persistent attacker found themselves facing a wider threat they had not planned for. By the time the fight finally began to break up, aircraft from both sides were scattered across a wide stretch of sky over the Assam Valley, some still exchanging fire, others already disengaging and turning for home. Elsewhere in that same sky, other pilots from the squadron were pressing their own attacks against bombers and fighters that had drifted away from the fight around Adair, and by the end of the morning, the combined efforts of every Banshee pilot who reached the battle would account for a bomber and 5 fighters confirmed destroyed, along with a longer list of aircraft damaged badly enough that their fate afterward was never fully known. Adair's own contribution to that tally, the first fighter destroyed and the disruption of the lead bomber group in those opening seconds, had done as much as anything else that morning to turn a coordinated raid into a scattered, ineffective mess of individual aircraft fighting for their own survival rather than pressing toward Dinjan. Adair's ammunition by this point was close to exhausted. Whatever ability he had left to influence the fight through direct attack was fading fast, guns falling silent one by one as their belts ran dry. He had done what he could do with the ammunition he carried. 2 aircraft destroyed, or credited as destroyed and damaged depending on which count you believed. A bomber and additional fighters marked down as damaged. A raid that had crossed into Allied airspace as a disciplined, dangerous formation of nearly 60 aircraft, now scattered across the sky in a running fight it had never planned to have this far from its target. His own aircraft carried the marks of the engagement across its skin, more than a dozen separate impacts by the time he finally broke off and turned for home. Rounds through the wings, the fuselage, the tail surfaces, a Warhawk that had earned every one of the scars it would carry for whatever remained of its service life. He had no ammunition left worth mentioning. His engine, remarkably, still ran clean, still answered the throttle the way it had at the start of the fight, the rugged Allison having absorbed a battle that might have ended very differently in a less forgiving airframe. Down at Dinjan, ground crews and CNAC loading personnel who had spent the morning watching the eastern sky for the raid they had been warned about saw only distant contrails and the faint, far-off crackle of gunfire carried on the wind, nothing close enough to send anyone running for cover. The transports on the ramp stayed untouched, engines silent, cargo doors still open where crews had been loading fuel drums and crated supplies bound for the airfields deeper in China. None of them would learn until later exactly how close that morning had come to ending very differently, or how much of the credit for that belonged to a single fighter pilot they never saw, fighting a battle that never came close enough to the field for anyone on the ground to witness it directly. For Adair, there was no such distance from what had just happened. He could still feel the adrenaline draining out of his hands as he leveled off, replaced by the flatter, heavier fatigue that always followed a fight like that, the kind that made ordinary tasks, checking gauges, holding a heading, feel suddenly effortful in a way they had not been 20 minutes earlier. He ran his eyes across the instrument panel out of habit more than any specific concern. Oil pressure normal. Coolant temperature within range. Fuel adequate for the short flight back to Nagaghuli. Whatever punishment his airframe had absorbed during the fight, the systems that kept him flying, the engine, the fuel lines, the control surfaces, battered but intact, had held when it mattered most. His hands, he noticed only now, had been gripping the stick tightly enough to ache. He flexed his fingers one at a time against the grip, working the stiffness out, and let the aircraft settle into a steady, level cruise for the first time in what had felt, from inside the fight, like a very long time indeed, though the clock on his instrument panel told a different story than his own sense of it. He allowed himself, for the first time since spotting the formation, a single steadying breath. The fight was behind him now, whatever its final cost turned out to be once he was back on the ground and the ground crew had a chance to count the bullet holes properly. Ahead of him lay only the short flight home, and the uncertain business of finding out exactly how much damage his aircraft had taken in exchange for whatever damage he had managed to inflict. There was nothing left to do but turn for Nagaghuli and put the aircraft down before anything else went wrong. Nagaghuli airfield came into view through a haze of afternoon heat, the runway a pale strip cut into the surrounding green, and Adair eased his damaged P-40 down through the pattern with the careful, deliberate movements of a pilot who had already used up whatever margin for error the morning had allowed him. The landing itself was unremarkable in the way that mattered most. Gear down, flaps set, a firm but controlled touchdown on the dirt strip, the Warhawk rolling out and slowing without complaint from an airframe that had absorbed considerably more punishment than any training manual would have considered survivable. Ground crews who had watched him take off that morning, as one pilot among many in a routine scramble, now watched him taxi in as something else entirely, an aircraft riddled with bullet holes along the wings, the fuselage, and the tail, a Warhawk that had clearly been through a fight far more serious than the uneventful patrols most mornings produced. Adair shut down the engine, and in the sudden quiet that followed, the full scale of what had just happened began to settle over the flight line. Ground crew counted the damage methodically, the way men who worked on these aircraft every day always did, running hands along torn aluminum skin, tracing the path of rounds that had punched through wing spars and fuselage stringers without striking anything critical enough to bring the aircraft down. By the time the count was finished, more than a dozen separate bullet strikes marked the airframe, a number that made the aircraft's safe return feel less like routine flying and more like the kind of outcome pilots in this theater rarely spoke about, except in low voices, aware of how easily it could have gone the other way. Adair climbed down from the cockpit, uninjured. That fact alone, given everything the aircraft around him had absorbed, said something about the P-40's reputation as an aircraft that could take punishment other fighters could not have survived. It was not fast. It was not elegant. It could not outturn the fighters it faced in this theater. But it kept flying when it had every right to fall out of the sky, and on this particular afternoon, that quality alone may have been the difference between a pilot walking away and a pilot who did not come home. He stood on the wing root for a moment before climbing down fully, looking back along the fuselage at the damage in the flat afternoon light, the same aircraft that had carried him aloft that morning, now wearing the visible record of everything it had survived in the hours since. Lulu Bell would fly again, patched and repaired by ground crews who had grown practiced at that kind of work over months in this theater, but she would carry the marks of this particular morning for as long as she remained in service. A quiet reminder to every pilot who climbed into her cockpit afterward of exactly how much punishment the airframe could take and keep flying regardless. There was little ceremony to any of it. No crowd gathered on the flight line, no immediate recognition beyond the quiet attention of the ground crew and the handful of fellow pilots who had either witnessed part of the fight from a distance or heard the radio traffic as it unfolded. That was, in its own way, characteristic of the entire theater. The China-Burma-India Command operated at the margins of the war's attention, and even an engagement as lopsided as this one drew little notice beyond the squadron and group level until the paperwork eventually worked its way up the chain of command. The debrief that followed pieced together what intelligence officers already suspected from radio traffic, and the scattered reports beginning to filter in from other pilots who had joined the fight late. Adair had made contact alone, well ahead of the rest of his flight, against a force of Japanese bombers and fighters that outnumbered him by a margin so severe that no standard tactical doctrine addressed it directly. He had attacked anyway, disrupting the lead bomber formation in his opening pass, and had continued fighting through a running battle with the escort screen even as his own aircraft absorbed hit after hit. When the official credits were tallied, they read simply enough on paper, stripped of the noise and fear and split-second decisions that had produced them. 1 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar destroyed. 1 Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bomber damaged. 2 additional Oscars damaged. Numbers that, on their own, might not have seemed extraordinary in a theater where dozens of similar engagements played out across the war. What made this particular engagement remarkable was the ratio behind those numbers. 1 American fighter against a raid that some accounts placed as high as 64 aircraft, and the fact that the pilot who produced them had done so entirely alone, by choice, when every rule he had been taught said he should have waited. The raid on Dinjan never reached its target in any organized, effective form. Whatever bombs the surviving Japanese aircraft eventually dropped that day fell without the concentrated accuracy a tight, undisturbed formation could have achieved. The transports on the ramp at Dinjan, loaded with fuel and cargo bound for China, remained intact. The fuel stocks that kept the hump airlift running stayed untouched. In the accounting that mattered most, the one measured in tons of supplies that continued flowing over the Himalayas to Chiang Kai-shek's forces, rather than going up in flames on a jungle airstrip, the raid had failed, and it had failed in large part because one lieutenant had refused to wait for reinforcements that would have arrived too late to matter. Word of the engagement moved up through the chain of command in the weeks that followed, and in time it reached Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell's headquarters, which oversaw American forces across the China-Burma-India theater. For his actions on December 13, 1943, Philip Adair was awarded the Silver Star, the citation recognizing a pilot who, badly outnumbered and flying without support, had pressed his attack against a formation many times his own strength, and by doing so, had helped prevent serious damage to a critical Allied supply installation. For Adair himself, there was no time to dwell on what had just happened. The war did not pause for a single pilot to process a single engagement, however remarkable, and within days, He was back on the flight line, back in the rotation of missions that defined life in the 89th Fighter Squadron. That, too, was part of the story rarely captured in the retelling of any single dramatic encounter. The fight over Dinjan was extraordinary, but it was also just one morning in a combat tour that stretched across many more missions, many more hours logged, many more mornings when the sky stayed empty and nothing happened at all. It was not the end of his war. Adair continued flying combat missions with the 80th Fighter Group through the following months, adding to his tally of confirmed victories, one engagement at a time, the way most fighter pilots did, not through single dramatic encounters, but through the steady accumulation of missions flown, formations engaged, and enemy aircraft destroyed in fights that rarely made it into official histories at all. By May of 1944, that accumulation had made him a three-time ace, 5 or more confirmed victories credited across his combat tour, a distinction shared by a relatively small number of pilots who flew the P-40 in this theater at all. Alongside the Silver Star, he would eventually be recognized with the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Legion of Merit, decorations that spoke to a career built not on any single legendary encounter, but on a consistent record of combat performance across an entire war. The 80th Fighter Group continued flying and fighting under the Burma Banshee's insignia until the final months of the war, its pilots and ground crews sustaining the same grinding, unglamorous mission that had defined its existence since its arrival in the theater, keeping the airfields of the hump route standing against a Japanese air threat that never fully went away until the war itself ended. The unit's combined record across those years included hundreds of enemy aircraft destroyed in the air and on the ground, a contribution to the war that rarely received the attention given to more famous squadrons flying more famous aircraft over more famous battlefields in Europe and the Central Pacific. The P-40 Warhawk itself never earned the reputation of the P-51 Mustang or the P-47 Thunderbolt, the aircraft that would come to define American air power in the popular memory of the war. It was slower. It struggled at high altitude. By the standards of 1943, in most theaters, it was already considered an aircraft on its way out of frontline service. But in the China-Burma-India theater, where resupply lagged behind every other front and pilots flew whatever aircraft they were given, the P-40 remained the backbone of American fighter operations until the very end of the war, and pilots like Adair proved, again and again, that an aircraft's reputation mattered less than the decisions made by the man flying it. What happened over the Assam Valley on December 13, 1943 was, in the end, a story about a choice made in the space of a few seconds, 4,000 feet above a bomber formation that outnumbered its lone attacker by a margin no training manual had ever prepared him for. Philip Adair could have orbited and called for help, watched the raid continue toward Dinjan while he waited for reinforcements that would have arrived only after the damage was already done. Instead, he pushed the throttle forward and accepted a fight that, by every rational measure, he was not supposed to survive. He came home with more than a dozen bullet holes in his aircraft, an empty ammunition belt, and a raid disrupted behind him. It was not the kind of victory that made headlines outside the small, unglamorous corner of the war he fought in. But for the ground crews, the transport pilots, and the supply lines that depended on Dinjan airfield remaining intact that afternoon, it was the only victory that mattered.